Thank you very much. I'm Frye, and I'll be the chair of this really terrific panel. And we'll have 8-minute presentations and about 10 minutes for discussion, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. And I think there's so many ways in which Russia's war in Ukraine is a historic event, and one of the ways that it is historic is that we're able to monitor it in real time so much better than relying on embedded journalists to tell us what was going on. So in this way, we can really take advantage of the technology, of the contact that people have to analyze the war in real time. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say about the topic. So we'll go in the order as listed in the program, and we'll begin with Kristina Hook.
Let's do a quick technology check. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for tuning in right after lunch. I don't take that honor lightly, so thank you very much for coming. So I should mention my background and what orients my presentation today. So I am a genocide scholar and work in atrocity prevention, and I've done that for about 15 years. Then in 2015, I returned to academia and I moved to Ukraine to do ethnographic research. I intended my work there to be solely focused on historical genocide narratives of the Ukrainian Holodomor during a time of war. But way I've seen the past year change my work is that a lot of my work in genocide forecasting and mass atrocity prevention is now moving to the forefront. So that should give you a little bit of background at where I'm coming at this issue from. So I call this diagnosing violence correctly. And what I argue in the memo, which you can access online, is that there are different types of violence that exist, even types of severe violence that can do lots of harm. And they're all morally heinous. We should try to target and prevent all of them. But you do have to come at genocide and other forms of mass atrocities differently. And what I argue in my memo, based on my own experience as a US policy advisor for mass atrocity prevention, formerly in my career, is that now, given the amount of Western assistance, given the severity of violence, diagnosing Russia's violent aims, figuring out exactly what's going on must be a key policy priority. But that's very much a part of the conversation about how to make sure the right aid, the right steps, the right ordering is correct. So I argue throughout my academic work that genocides differ from other forms of mass atrocities. And this question about if an event is a genocide is not just a question for lawyers doing after-action reviews, seeking for accountability. That's very important too. But I also argue that we can sort of figure out what we're looking at. We can diagnose this violence in real time as it unfolds. And so that's what I'm arguing. That's the position I take in this work. And, there's a lot of disagreement in comparative genocide literature. We are well known in the field of genocide research for having really loud arguments at our conferences. However, we have sort of heroes of the field who do these meta reviews, and they say, do genocide scholars agree on anything? And they do. There are two questions that there is field-wide consensus that help us to separate in real time if we're looking at a case of genocide or if we're looking at some other type of also morally heinous mass violence, but just something that's different than a genocide. And so these two questions that we ask in real time are who's targeted and for what purpose? So I won't go into this too much. It's pretty technical, it's pretty academic. I'd love to speak with my fellow scholars or anyone else who's interested later, but I'll just pull out a couple of different things. The first is intended purpose, and the latter part is intended targets. I think I'll work from the bottom up. So intended targets is who's targeted. We see in some types of cases of violence where just teenage boys will be targeted. They're often viewed as future combatants. But in a genocide, you're really looking for perpetrators targeting men, women, children, undifferentiated violence in that sense. And we also try to separate in real time, are we looking at a case of repression, severe battery, harm, even just the eroding of sovereignty? That's really different ideologically than aiming for the destruction in whole or in part, which is what genocide is. So in my academic work, there's lots of ways that we use proxy variables. We come at this from an empirical sense, and it helps us to organize all of the things that people say in these very chaotic, very violent environments. It helps us to sort of weed out what people are doing and why. So in my policy memo, I argue that Russia does intend to destroy Ukraine. This is actually a case where it's much more obvious than other cases that I have worked. I think this reflects a real sense on many of the perpetrators' parts that they won't face justice for their actions. So I want to point out just a couple of things. This narrative of Ukraine and Russia are one. In my policy memo, I go through some of the specific language that backs this up, but it's coming from President Putin on down the line. There are other things to talk about we cannot exist with Ukraine. I just want to point out, especially this first one, because I get asked about it, but this idea that Ukraine and Russia are one, that they would be one if they weren't separated from, in the perpetrator's minds, this historical accident that actually perpetrates the erasure of the Ukrainian national group. And I want to point out that language of national group. So when we're looking at the UN Genocide Convention, it's racial or ethnic, religious or national group. Scholars go even farther, but if we just stay focused on the UN, I think we're looking at a case of the targeting of the Ukrainian national group. So I get questions often from reporters or other policy advisors about ethnic cleansing or asking about differences with different maybe Russian ethnic minorities or language speakers in Ukraine. It's really better to ask that this is a phenomenon that's targeting the Ukrainian national group. So all of Ukraine, whether you are of a Ukrainian heritage background or not. And so this genocidal language by President Putin on down, I go through this in the memo, so I didn't want to spend my time here. I wanted to talk more about the so what, but you can read more about the case that I'm making in the memo. So let's talk about why it matters. This is where comparative genocide scholarship, which has been around since the Holocaust, can help clarify what we're looking at. And so really we begin to look at these networks of actors in Russian society. So the perpetrators are the most obvious. We're talking about Russian soldiers and war fighters, PMCs and others. We're also talking though about the organizers, these networks. So these include Russian bureaucrats, occupation authorities, military recruiters, planners and advisors, the passportization processes, so these consular officers, children's services who participate in the forced deportations. Then we're also looking at authorizers, the strategic level of Putin and security service elite down through the commanders who authorize these genocidal battlefield orders. We're also looking at enablers, and I bring this up because it's often talked about the prosecution of Rwandan radio hosts after the fact. But looking now at the powerful role that they play in their society, it's also something that we have to pay attention to. We've got to sort of separate out who's participating in this social process. And it really is important to think about genocide as this extreme social behavior. So it's an outlying behavior, but it's a socio-political behavior nonetheless. And that's also why the role of bystanders is very important historically in all types of genocide. So my next slide is really some well-established findings from the field of genocide studies. I'm happy to share the citations for these with my colleagues later, but these are well-known ideas within genocide studies. I'm not really trying to pick on Russia. I'm saying this is what happens in all types of genocidal societies. So if we're going to argue that this won't happen to Russian society, we would have to argue that Russia is maybe unusually cohesive, unusually preoccupied with humanistic concerns, unusually resistant to following orders. We have to argue that they're just a statistically outlying society. And if not, if they sort of behave as the way we've seen other perpetrator societies behave, this might be some of what we expect to see. It's really important to know we sort of have a well-established finding, I'm quoting here James Waller, but that historically genocides didn't really occur when there's like a specific number of killers. They occur when there's key architects that become surrounded by this passive critical mass. They just don't face enough resistance, and it usually happens over time. And it's also a sort of a situation where violence is often expressed at first as unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but it's permissible. And then what we've seen happen historically is that there's this larger societal process where worldviews shift. There's this psychological construction of the victims as subhumans. That's why those enablers are important. And where cruelty becomes rewarded, like socially rewarded. And so this is something called moral reorientation. And this is where we often see violence transfers in people's mind from this unfortunate, but like just passively permissive, you just don't want to get involved, to actively ethical. And what we see often found in societies like this, we see language like this: we must do this unpleasant thing for our children, for our grandchildren, to protect our future, for Russia. It has shifted from being unfortunate, but just I don't want to get involved, it's passively permissive, to actively, in the new mind frame, ethically ethical, protecting someone you care about. And these are very unpredictable and unstable dynamics that even the authoritarian leaders no longer fully control. And you can't really put that back in the bottle. It's just different. And so these can entrench and prolong Russian societal dynamics that some of my colleagues in this room have been calling defensive consolidation. I think we're coming at this from a similar perspective. So I'll just keep moving pretty quickly, but I want to say too that it's just really important when we look at the extreme social behavior of genocide that we understand that these are really rare events, but we kind of know how they end, because they do end, as my middle point says, they kind of end in a total victory. So somebody successfully destroys and whole or in part a group. We might think about some of the violence under Mao, under Stalin in this way, where they were not even acknowledged for so many years. We might think about the most well-known case, the Holocaust, where it was stopped with the help of outside interveners. And there are also cases where the victim group successfully fights back. I think that's important to understand. I'm thinking of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a group associated with the victim group that really played the key role in stopping that violence. And this is important because it's been sort of, very, very worrying for me, very worrying to see these sort of indicators I go through my larger work, this evidence of genocide, because genocide perpetrators do tend to take on greater inconvenience, take on greater risks, and they'll pay greater costs. So here, if we remember the so-called Islamic State, they chased the Yazidi group up a mountain. That's tactically not a great thing to do, and it's also really challenging and hard, and you've got to figure out logistics. So that's what we can really expect with the Russian side. I wrote this over, in the sort of early days of understanding this as a genocide. I think we have seen the Russians really double down. And I also want to point out that genocides their totalizing aims come with these profound social changes. One of the things that's been, really sad, like to be candid, really sad, is the role of many Ukrainians, and I've had this personal experience too, of people in Russia not believing us when we're talking about what's happening. And so got to be really realistic that access to information isn't the root of the problem there. It's more about these psychological changes, these self-protective mechanisms. I'm going to wrap up, I promise. I wrote one article that talks about what the US and the West should do. So for my PONARS memoir, I talked about the UN. I'm short on time, so I might just put this up for a minute and you can refer to the PONARS memo, and I'll be happy to take more questions later about any of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Marat Iliyasov.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, with war in Ukraine developing, war Chechnya comes more and more into public space, and that's what I want to talk today about. Is there a new chance for Chechen independence? To begin with, I want to say that a couple of weeks ago, here in Washington, Jamestown Foundation and Hudson Institute hosted an event called Preparing for the Dissolution of the Russian Federation. And among the speakers there was Foreign Minister of Chechen Republic of Chechnya. For those who do not know, Chechnya was the republic de facto independent Chechnya. And this government that in Al-Sharif, the foreign minister of Republic of Chechnya represents, claims its succession from the governments of Kadyrov and Masada, again, de facto independent Chechnya. So it is logical to that to this event, foreign minister of Chechnya was invited, because if we think about separatism in Russia and the probability of Russia following the path of Soviet Union, it was pretty much only Chechnya that expressed its desire to be independent and actually demonstrated its will to defend its independence. So today I invite you to assess this probability of Chechnya becoming independent and Russia following the path of Soviet Union. To begin with, I want you to consider some facts. And I divided them into three categories, which actually could lead into independence of Chechnya. So first, what can get Chechnya into its independence from Russia would be open rebellion, fight, war. Second, it would be political changes in Russia that would also grant Chechnya independence. And third, it would be international support and recognition. In terms of the first one, we can think that, yes, current regime in Chechnya is not the best for the population, and many Chechens are unhappy in there. We have also active politicians from the times of de facto independent Chechnya, times of Kadyrov and Masada, who are active still in Europe, and not only. One more fact that around 20%, according to some other estimates, even higher, of Chechens live abroad in Europe. And these are people who are mostly openly opposing regime. One more fact to consider is Chechen volunteer participation in the Ukrainian war on the Ukrainian side. Regarding the international recognition of Chechnya, it was not long ago, autumn of 2022, just a few months ago, that Ukrainian parliament recognized Chechnya as temporarily occupied territory. And in terms of changes, political changes in Russia, well, different research show differently, and we heard from the previous panel that there are also different numbers that indicate that there is support still quite significant to Putin's war in Ukraine, even though these numbers are not very solid. There are questions to all these facts. And these questions are, first of all, is Chechen population ready to rebel against Kadyrov's government? Is it ready to reclaim its independence? And to my mind, it is not. I think most of the Chechen population would want to live in peace. The atrocities of the war that were in Chechnya, and they're still very fresh in the mind of the population. Of course, we can think that it is not necessary that the whole population would be ready, that there is a small amount of people that can drive it into independence, but this is a different consideration, and there is no actually possibility to conduct some kind of study that would confirm that there is a certain amount of population that would be actually ready to support this claim. What about Chechens? 20%, quite substantial number. Are they ready to fight? Some of them are, and the war in Ukraine proved it. So those who were ready to fight, they are already in Ukraine. And what about others? Others who actually fought during the both Chechen wars, they are already of age that sometimes health does not allow just physical participation in actual warfare. So, and plus, is there any possibility? There are claims that Chechen armed forces reborn in Ukraine, but is there? Do you imagine that Chechens are marching through the whole territory to Chechnya from Ukraine, Chechen force? I hardly imagine the situation. And what about Chechen nationalist government? Yes, they are active in Europe, but right now there are 3 governments of Chechen Republic of Chechnya in Europe, and all of them are claiming their own right to be successors of Dudayev and Maskhadov government. So there is no actual unity, and this will lead to another problem that I will talk about shortly. About the recognition. So what Chechen Republic had in terms of recognition. From the early 1990s, when it declared independence, Chechnya was recognized 3 times. First by Georgian government in exile, which was exiled in Chechnya, Komsomol's government. Second time by Afghanistan, Taliban, in 1997. Taliban had problems with its own recognition back then. And third time, it was recent recognition by Ukrainian parliament, which actually I do not see that anybody else followed in the world. So Chechnya has actually fewer recognition than Abkhazia or South Ossetia, unfortunately. And well, and the question is about if the West is ready to support Chechen claim for independence or changes in Russia. And here I'm coming back to my initial point about the conference that was organized by Jamestown and Hudson Institute. And there were much more questions asked in a similar way by many other scholars and politicians and military generals before that. So preparing for the dissolution of Russian Federation, for it to follow the path of Soviet Union. And actually, I recall that these kind of questions coming from even early 1990s. So the first question, if Russia will follow the path of Soviet Union, was asked right in 1991, I believe, something like that. And Russia is still there. So to conclude, I want to say that in my mind, to my mind, it's quite weak probability that Russia will dissolve or Chechnya will get its independence shortly. But there are also some other questions that we cannot rule out. Putin is not invincible and he is also human. He can die at some point. There is also probability of palace coup, and to quote Donald Rumsfeld, there are many other unknowns. And here is hope. Thank you.
Well, my presentation posed Marat very well. I'm engaging in a topic that has become extremely popular these days, whether Russia will implode like Soviet Union, whether Russia will fall into a civil war, where warlords, violent entrepreneurs will have a pretty important comparative advantage in fighting for power, most likely driven by reports. Everybody these days on Twitter or around became expert on Wagner, Prigozhin, and what it will happen and with prison, with recruitment, and the feud with military forces. My question is not whether or not there will be a civil war. My question is not whether or not Soviet Union, Russia will follow the path of Soviet Union. It's quite the opposite. I don't really predict. I'm looking at the world. I'm looking at what's going on. So the memo is about one of those violent entrepreneurs that has been existing in Putin's political regime forever, is that addressing and changing its own strategy in order to survive and thrive into the Ukrainian context and potentially the post-conflict or chaos-based Russia. But the idea is not whether you ask me if there will be a civil war. I can tell you my opinion. I don't think so. I don't think Marat explained very well why it will not come from the Caucasus. We can discuss the same thing about why it will not come from, for the moment, from Russia itself. We can keep that for another panel. People have covered it by discussing about Wagner rising and recruiting. People this morning discussed about how context of a failing invasion and struggle in war might lead to nationalist circle being motivated to challenge the government or the far right. What we have seen in Bryansk last week or this week even is an example of something that we can see more. There was recently a policy memo wrote about Cossack and the high number of motivation and mobilization right now in the war in Ukraine. In other words, you have a lot of violent entrepreneurs. You have the potential for a civil war. But at the same time, the important thing is, can we better understand what those violent entrepreneurs are doing right now in order to stabilize or make sure they thrive in this environment? So the memo looks at Ramzan Kadyrov and the Kadyrovцы with regard to the engagement in Chechnya, in Ukraine, and in federal politics. So in a nutshell, what we're seeing is Kadyrov is leaving Chechnya, leaving his traditional base of stability, where he established himself as a loyal soldier of the Chechenization process in Chechnya, to engage in federal politics. It is not new to see Kadyrov challenging federal ministers, challenging the FSB, the GRU, and others, but it was always on the base of Chechnya. If you're coming in Chechnya, I'll tell you, I'll engage and compete with you. Whether it is the fighting with Yamadayev, the fighting with the GRU, the FSB back in the days. But what is happening right now is Kadyrov has opened a front of confrontation with the Russian army. Not the full Russian army, but some part of it. Starting in September 2022, he was extremely critical of prisoner exchange with Ukraine, mostly from the Azov battalion and people from Mariupol. He openly lynched the political deciders or political actors linked to the Russian Defense Ministry. In October 2022, he was extremely critical of the high level of incompetency of the military, the general staff with regard to Liman, the retreat in Liman, and what happened in northeastern Ukraine. It was voiced openly and got supported by many actors, including Prigozhin, for example. Later in the fall, we see slowly but surely an informal functional alliance between Kadyrov, Prigozhin, and Surovikin, where Kadyrov supported the withdrawal from southern Ukraine or from Kherson or the west bank of the Dnieper River. So Kadyrov engaged very early in the fall in a very confrontational approach where he believed to be a national hero for Russia. He believed to have a higher ranking level, himself calling himself a general as he got the promotion. But the idea is that Kadyrov is moving away from Chechen and North Caucasus in order to engage in this federal politics. In a way, he might not believe that a civil war is coming. He might not be believing that Russia will dissolve, but at the same time, he's creating power backing alliances and a relationship in order to thrive in such environment. So again, the idea is that Kadyrov might be understanding that its special relationship with Putin and with the regime might be at risk with what is going on in Ukraine and what's going on generally in politics. So throughout the fall, we've seen Kadyrov engaging with certain generals within the Russian army engaging with Wagner punctually on different missions or relationships. We have seen Kadyrov placing his own people across many power ministries in Russia, including the Federal Ministry for Emergencies, including the National Guard, and the relationship that usually Kadyrov did not really intend to keep. At the same time, we've seen Kadyrov placing people within Donetsk and Luhansk Republic, particularly in charge of some of the forces. We still don't know what will happen, whether these forces will be integrated within the Russian armed forces, but at the same time, Kadyrov is placing its chess pieces in order to be able to swiftly react to any tension within Russia by creating alliances or moving into federal politics. But this comes at the major cost. The more you engage in federal politics, the least is engaging in North Caucasus and Chechen politics. And we start seeing the weakening grip of Ramzan Kadyrov, particularly over Chechnya and over controlling mobilization of the population and protest. In September, Kadyrov decided not to repress protests against the mobilization, the partial mobilization. Most of the repression in Chechnya since the summer is dedicated into replenishing volunteer battalion from Chechnya to send them to the front. In other words, the tools that were used in the past to prevent Chechens to organize against the regime are mostly now invested into the bid for federal politics of Ramzan Kadyrov. Add to that heavy casualties in Kyiv, Mariupol, Semenov, these days around Bakhmut, where Kadyrov sustained heavy losses that will prevent them to be as military functional as they were around 2011, 2012, when they were more active. As Marat underlined, you have with that a growing movement opposing Kadyrov in Ukraine. Yes, they are extremely fragmented. Marat mentioned about the 3 different governments in exile or the so-called government in exile, but you have suddenly many thousands of fighters who have connected for years in Syria, in Turkey, in Ukraine, in Western Europe that are being armed and trained in Ukraine these days. They do not all agree on how to topple the regime. They do not really know how to reach Chechnya. But as we've seen with returnees, foreign fighters, and a transnational nature of wars, when you get those forces, it is not if, but when and how they will create problems. A lot of people said the returnees from Syria will not play a major role because of the Islamic State losing, because of the change with regard to the different group. But in the last couple of weeks, we have seen easily 40, 50, 60 veterans of the Syrian civil war traveling through Turkey, Poland, and Ukraine, reaching one of the de facto government linked to the Ichkeria government. So at this point in time, you have a weakened Kadyrov in terms of repression in Chechnya, a stronger opposition outside of its border, and you have the known unknown of the population in Chechnya, whether they are ready or not to mobilize. But you certainly see here a different context in which, for Kadyrov, it is playing at the federal level. It is reaching the top of the political ladder, but it is with the conscious choice that his activities in Ingushetia and Dagestan will have to be reduced, even though we have seen claims about Dagestani territory there. And finally, to discuss about that, it is indirectly affecting the traditional bargain between Kadyrov and Putin these days. Most likely because Kadyrov has now to deal with a new wave of discourse coming to mobilize people in Russia, and particularly in Chechnya, talking about the decolonization discourse. many Chechens, many minorities are using it, put together law-abiding Salafis, put together minorities, ethnicities, put together hardcore Salafi or other religious actors. Everybody has been adopting the idea of decolonization toward Russia. They have political claims, and they start to engage much more about discourse on self-determination for Chechnya or for other regions. We have seen for Dagestan, we have seen it for Chechen, we've seen it most likely slowly but surely in Ingushetia also. And surprisingly, Kadyrov last month started calling himself a hard believer or a hard believer of Ichkeria. He criticized openly Poland and the EU for never supporting the independence of Ichkeria. Suddenly, 20, 30 years later, they are starting to talk about Ichkeria. And Kadyrov was extremely critical toward them for forgetting Chechnya and its independence. Kadyrov is entering in a way in this double discourse where he's trying to fuse loyalty to the Putin regime for Ukraine, Russian patriotism, as well as Chechen self-determination and decolonization discourse. Many of you will say it doesn't make any sense. It's literally two discourses that oppose each other. Well, Kadyrov in the past managed to fuse traditional Chechen identity, Sufism, and a part of Salafism together to create a hybrid ideology, religious or political ideology, sustaining his own regime. Being very orthodox in a way, but very traditional in another way, engaging in Sufism as much as engaging with soft, law-abiding Salafi. So in a way, it is not impossible that Kadyrov might manage for a second time in his life to simply mix-match ideologies in a very weird way to achieve his political goals. But at the end of the day, it is a major gamble. It is Kadyrov believing that he can challenge power ministries, including the Russian army, including the National Guard, including other actors in Moscow, with the military forces he has right now, and also preparing to find a place in a situation where Russian ultranationalists, as well as the far right, might become much more emboldened and strong in the declining Russia. If it is the case, Kadyrov will struggle to create any punctual alliances with ultranationalists. So in a way or another, he is prepping for a war that might come, but that he has high doubt that might be coming, at least from the way I'm perceiving it. But I'm happy to discuss about the potential of a civil war. I'm happy that you entertain it. I'm happy that you create scenarios and conspiracy theories. Isn't it what we all do when we do Russian studies?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, through the magic of technology, we'll hear from Andrei, hopefully.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, team. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. I'll start sharing the screen then. Hopefully it will work as well. So can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, good to be at PONARS, even though I'm just offline. My presentation is a little bit different from the rest of the panel, but hopefully some of the topics will also resonate with what has been said before. This is a joint project with Maxim Marikov from King's College London and Maria Kunilovskaya. So basically, I'm not the one who's behind this project, and this is the project about Russian propaganda in traditional media and how it penetrates the social media. Back in summer 2022, we've been doing this for a while. So we have 2 reports. We don't have a PONARS memo yet. We hope to write it in the coming month or so. But we have 2 reports, and if you want to have some details on that, on the workings behind this presentation, behind this talk, I will be happy to share the links. So basically, I will in this talk, the time is limited, so I'll talk just about motivation data and some findings, and I'll focus on particularly on a couple of findings that we have been, I hope, able to get from the data. We hadn't any sort of initial hypothesis or theory when we start doing this project, because this was just an opportunity to scrap the data from traditional media and from social media that were related to the war, Russian war in Ukraine. So basically, when we started thinking about this project, we started with just simple things like the propagandist content, what were the key concepts, what were the topics, what was the content dynamics, say what was the dynamics of the frequencies of the words like denazification, demilitarization, how these narratives reacted to the external shocks, to the changes in the battlefield. And particularly we were interested how this Russian media propaganda penetrated the social media, because back in the spring 2022, but also I think right now there is a lot of discussion about how public opinion is relevant when it's coming to just understanding Russian the perceptions of Russians. And we decided that maybe another angle on this topic, if we'll just try to assess it from the social media world. In the future, we also want to do, of course, a more rigorous analysis, but at the moment, it's just a simple analysis of frequencies of topics and specific terms that are associated with the war. Basically, we have a large corpus. It includes both TV, print, and electronic media, also social media. I'll focus here only on social media, but this is the project itself is larger. We were able to scrap all this textual data from using the scan interface. We have, as you can see in the screen, we have some specific context keywords to retrieve the relevant messages from both traditional media and social media. We also manually checked if the content sort of fits into our concept, and it looks like most of the messages and reports we've been able to scrap, they speak to the topic. There are some limitations in this data, of course. We try to limit, first of all the messages, all the reports from social media and in traditional media blocked in Russia currently, like Medusa, TV Rain, Instagram, Facebook. We were not able to scrap them systematically. Another thing is that we opted for the scan interface option to identify only users with Russian IP. That's why it's only confined to those discussions, online discussions that took place in Russia itself, or we assume they took place in Russia. So all the discussions outside are not accounted in this data. But basically, that was our primary focus, that we wanted to check what's going on in Russian media sphere. We had a cap of 1 million messages per month, so we are below this cap, and maybe, I don't know whether it's good or not, but yeah, we can come back to that. So it's not a lot of the volume of war-related context is not as big as we expected the first time. And finally, for the analysis that I'll present here and for the reports, we used the aggregated on 3 days periods, lemmatized keywords, and we normalized them per 100,000 words in this period, so we can directly compare the frequencies and say that there is some dynamics, or there is some one keyword or one topic is more frequent than the other. And here I mostly will focus on the cross-platform comparisons. One of our idea was that if propaganda works, it should, of course, affect all social platforms, but probably it will affect these platforms unevenly. So, for instance, we have Odnoklassniki, Vkontakte, and Telegram social media as the major platforms available for these public discussions at the moment. And these platforms have a specific demographic composition, and they also have specific technical requirements. Telegram is considered more secured, and apparently Kontakte and Odnoklassniki are heavily monitored by Russian authorities, and especially law enforcement authorities, in order to prevent the war-related context, especially anti-war context, to appear online. So in my talk here, I will concentrate only on this cross platform analysis, but just to give you maybe a larger picture, this is what how our corpus looks like for the official press and TV from July to September. And in a previous report, for instance, we noted, as others reporters also noted, that from February until July, there was a general decline in coverage of war-related topics in Russian official media. But here we can see that by the end of July, and then steadily up until the partial mobilization announcement in late September, there was a steady growth of messaging about the war in official press and TV. Unlike official press and TV, it looks like social media are mostly stable in terms of covering the war in Ukraine. So you can see on the right the same thing, the weekly aggregates for social media, the number of documents we obtained in the data. There is a little bit an uptick in, again, by the end of September, apparently covering the events of partial mobilization. So this is the overall dynamics. And when it comes to the breakdown of our social platforms, you can see here the breakdown for 3 major platforms: July, August, and September. And the majority of discussion, it looks like, is still going on Kontakte. So this is the largest social media social media platform in Russia. It's quite diverse in terms of age composition, demographic, and other demographics. So no wonder that it's the major platform for discussion at the moment. Odnoklassniki follows online, and then Telegram comes third. We have also a fraction of messages on Facebook and Instagram, but this is the Odnoklassniki, Kontakte, and Telegram cover 25% of our documents in the data, meaning that this is basically the place where Russians now discuss war-related content. And one thing that sort of surprised us, and that's what I'm going to focus today, is that the dynamics in social media is quite interesting in terms of for some topics, and here you can see the topics, the key justification words for invasion: denazification, demilitarization, and this support or the protection of Donbas people. And you can see in dashed lines or dotted lines the messages that were duplicated at some point of time. So this is the upticks are the huge volumes of these duplicate messages with the same, again, key term, containing the same key term that appeared, for instance, in late July, then in late August, then in early September. So that was, it captured our attention, and we started to dig this a little bit more. And that's what we eventually call the AstroTurf communication. So the idea that the Kremlin, being aware that a lot of communication regarding the war is going on online, has been preparing with the propaganda machine for years for this kind of events. And there is a large pro-government networks and groups and publics and Kontakte and Odnoklassniki and Telegram channels. There are bots and trolls and everything, and they might try to promote certain messages as they are grassroots rather than government promoted. So here, I think this is one example of that, and a very rude example that at some points of time, it looks like pro-governmental networks launched huge campaigns promoting specific messages. For instance, again, considering denazification, demilitarization. And our further investigation led us to the following picture. So for different social platforms, it looks like this AstroTurf or artificially inflated messaging appears to be in some networks rather than the others. Here is the picture for Odnoklassniki, again for the key terms denazification, demilitarization, and you can see clearly here that that was mostly Odnoklassniki who drove these ticks in the dynamics of the usage of these terms. We also identified these messages. They were promoted either by Sut Remini or by some other conservative pro-governmental groups. But in order to be this effective and in order to be this sort of huge in terms of volume, it looks like they had to have some support for that. Compared this picture with the Telegram, it's much more noisy in terms of dynamics. There is the duplicate also exists, but there's not so many duplicates in Telegram channels when it comes to denazification and demilitarization, and that led us to this idea that probably, again, the government is quite aware of the differences between the platforms, and it chooses the platforms that where he can actually not buy the loyalty of swing voters, of those who are in doubt regarding the military operation, but to ensure that the loyals still loyal, and Odnoklassniki is particularly exemplary in this regards, because this is the platform where most of these plus 40 men and others communicate with each other. So probably that was a strategic decision to promote specific messages regarding the war, the pro-war messages and narratives, especially on Odnoklassniki. And also just to maybe to explore this topic further, one of the important topics in pro-war narrative is the whole bunch of dehumanizing language, like Ukronazis, Ukrops, etc. And you can see again that Odnoklassniki is a primary target for the AstroTurf communication in this regards. Other platforms do not exhibit these spiky patterns, and neither Odnoklassniki or Telegram has this sort of these spikes in and duplicates when it comes to dehumanization language. And also note the amount of this, the volume of this language. It's far above, for instance, again, terms like denazification or demilitarization, and also not a threat, etc. So it looks like, again, this is one of the major aims of the government to promote the dehumanization language against the Ukrainians in Russian platforms. And to look from the other angle, when it comes to anti-war narratives, for instance, calling war Russian invasion, again, Telegram remains the most independent platforms, and no duplicates, no AstroTurf campaigns appears there. And apparently, again, Telegram is this kind of main platform for independent discussion. So maybe I'll skip a couple of slides and we'll get directly to summary. And I'm happy to, again, to talk more about our other findings, but to focus on specific points that we've uncovered related to AstroTurf communication. It looks like the government is quite aware of the differences between the platforms. That's why, again, the Odnoklassniki is the main target for this kind of promoting specific narratives. Also, maybe less expensive for the Kremlin to engage with the Odnoklassniki rather than Telegram. And Telegram is smaller. In general, of course, the narratives like collective wealth, not a threat, dehumanization of Ukrainians, etc., still constitute the backbone of pro-war narratives on social media, and attempts to build other narratives, for instance, promoted in Temniki in these topical guidelines that Medusa discovered in July. They mostly failed. They do not pick up. And also those messages that we find as duplicates, so the promotion campaigns, they also do not find any sort of a huge resonance with the public. But collective threat, dehumanization language, and defense of traditional values, it looks like these are the major topics to justify the war in Ukraine. I'll stop here. Thanks a lot. I'll be happy to answer questions or take comments.
Thank you very much, and thanks for staying up. Miriam, I'll turn the floor over to you for really terrific presentations that have a lot of comments. So then we'll open up the floor for a discussion.
Indeed. Indeed, I thought those were excellent presentations. Sure. And the others should, and there's, and maybe I won't echo as much. Okay, these four papers hang together very, very well because the underlying theme is how does Russia prosecute war? And that is, as Kristina described, in a genocidal fashion. There was a report published just now with Memorial Human Rights Center in Novaya Gazeta that talks about the cycle of impunity. It goes back to Afghanistan. You can trace, certainly since the Chechen War, individual careers in atrocities. You can see what specific individuals did in Chechnya and later in Ukraine. I have lots of it was a deeply persuasive and provocative and fascinating paper that you did, and I was actually initially trying to argue and I didn't start out thinking, well, this is a genocide, but as you go through, it becomes extremely persuasive. I was wondering about the Yugoslav type tribunal, like I was kind of missing some of the lawyering. That, what is in the convention, how has the convention grown and been adapted in different situations? You mentioned Xinjiang, and the point that 2 out of 5 permanent members of the Security Council are themselves perpetrators, so how can you possibly get justice for this? Strikes me as enormously important. Is that the big difference with Yugoslavia, is whether you're actually a member of the, and how do you pursue it? Andrei's presentation just now, just to like take it a point further in terms of awareness and intent. So it's taking a, completely distorted historical narrative using anti-Nazi weird language, while we also know that they built the filtration camps before the war. So in terms of intent, the language used, the whole ideology around what's happening, I think your case is very, very strong. But I would be curious, like how can we try to get closer to justice? And do you think it's important, for instance, to take the Ukraine situation now separately? Is it important to Ukrainians that there be like a tribunal on Ukraine? Or is it more important to try to capture the whole thing and go back to Chechnya, Afghanistan, elsewhere, and try to describe indeed this whole cycle of impunity? Okay, coming to Chechnya, your other point that it's totalizing, that the end is going to be something totalizing. And both of our Chechnya scholars said that Russia is not likely to come apart, which I also, at the start of all of this, I completely agreed that it's not likely to come apart. Indeed, we haven't seen it was only Chechnya that ever called for independence. I'm not aware of anything recent protests have been overblown completely. You have women saying, please don't take my sons. That does not constitute a desire necessarily for independence or any kind of particular political direction or orientation. However, if it is totalizing, if the end of this is going to be something totalizing, and if Russia may lose, the situation becomes incredibly unpredictable. And then I don't think it's about, I don't think we should take Chechnya and North Caucasus separately. We should just look at Russia as a whole, and you see all sorts of movements for decentralization. You see that people in general would want to see much stronger, whether that's Khabarovsk or Ekaterinburg, you've seen all sorts of protests and just stronger sense of local government, federalism, having a local government that's responsible to you, and you've seen trends like that for a long time. I thought the comment about shifting to Jean-François' that independence could be Kadyrov, and he's positioning himself for that. That's a great point. He's extremely malleable in terms of his ideology. There are other pieces that I would say about him that, you know, his authority stems from Putin personally, so he has to play at the federal level. Should somehow Putin be gone, he needs to sell himself as, you know, I will stabilize the North Caucasus for you to anybody who's newly in that role. Kadyrov has taken on for himself the protector of all the Muslims in Russia. He has a foreign policy. He has all sorts of contacts in the Middle East. It's sort of informal. He's also useful as an informal go-between in the Middle East. So he's extremely interesting to watch. I'm not sure that he's lost anything at home, that he's vulnerable somehow. Because his you know, he's not locally supported necessarily ever, that he can play the federal game, and that just reaffirms him at home. And then the other side of it, which is I'm fascinated, and I haven't had time to really look into it, but what is going on the Chechens fighting on the Ukrainian side, where, you know, as Marat mentioned, 3 different governments and I guess 4 different battalions, but that's potentially a new generation of leaders who may come up and may pose challenges, not in the sense that they will march from Ukraine, but in the sense that they will have proven themselves in some way in a different setting, and you know, may therefore in some future and unpredictable scenario have political futures at home. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. These were all 4 fascinating papers.
Do any of the panelists want to respond to the comments?
I do guys do. Thank you so much. These were great questions. Am I being heard? Yes. So there was a question about impunity, accountability, so separating out the prosecutorial aspects is really important. There's the case for prosecution of the crime of aggression, which would just prosecute Russian leadership. Then there's also prosecution for atrocity crimes, which the UN defines as crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And that's prosecuted down from individual soldiers who participate in war crimes up through the top. There's been significantly, I thought the challenge would be the crime of aggression, actually. There's been a lot of movement on getting that set up and getting funding secured for it. I would also say, you mentioned the ICTY, the Tribunal for Yugoslavia. I had a senior US policymaker ask a while back, like, is it worthwhile to collect evidence on Putin if there's such concern that he might not be prosecuted? And I always say, regardless, yes, because prosecuting in absentia is really important. There's also a legal obligation. That's what I keep trying to remind people too. You have 154 countries that have legally obligated themselves to both prevent and punish. But more than that, I point back to Slobodan Milosevic, who was president when a dossier was compiled on his crimes, and then events happened. Suddenly he wasn't president and he was prosecuted. So you always need to plan for that. I also just wanted to clarify that when I use this word total victory, I don't necessarily view that as Russia coming apart. I think that there's a credible scenario in which Ukraine is well positioned, in my view, to have its victory, to even secure its 1991 borders, and for Putin to stay in power. And I say that because when I look at the people who have left Russia, I'm noticing not only, of course, like the economic, the brain drain, as we call it, or even people who are liberal leaving, but psychologically, I'm looking at people who have a tendency to be active leaving, right? Like you are running away from mobilization, even if you're not an economically privileged person, you have like a trait of being active. And so I could see a scenario in which society is aware that they have not won the war, but decides to just live with that and not make waves. And that would mean Putin remains in power. And so I just wanted to clarify what I mean by that. I'll stop talking for now. I want to yield the floor.
Don't
I have a couple of points.
I have a question for Andrei. First of all, very interesting work. Is it you find these differences across platforms and attribute them to the demographic profile of the users of the platforms? They're also different size. So a different explanation might be that Telegram is just not worth as much effort as these other platforms that have a bigger footprint. Is there some way to distinguish these two points of view? Because they do have kind of different implications for how we view the Russian government's attempt to police online behavior. On one model, they're just like most bureaucrats, lazy. I'm sorry if I'm stepping on any toes here. And just the usual assumption that bureaucrats go after the low-hanging fruit, not the harder ones. The other one is that no, the Russian state's really smart, and it's distinguishing between these demographics, and it's able to allocate resources in that fashion.
Thanks. And it's a fascinating question, of course, because I think prior was that social demographic drives it, because as the idea was that as we found this sort of differences between the platforms, was that definitely the Kremlin was interested in maybe spreading the propaganda evenly across the platforms, given into account even the size. Because first of all, they developed these fantastic capabilities, these networks, this infrastructure for spreading false news, false narratives, and for spreading this propaganda. And it's still operational, it's still capable. So why not trying to cover everything, including Telegram as well, which is the most oppositional in terms of just simply because, again, of the technical nature of this platform. Kontakty is now under Mail Group, and Odnoklassniki is also heavily controlled by the state. So our idea was that, Telegram should be controlled more, or should with the messages that we found as pro-war should be spread more on Telegram rather than on the Odnoklassniki of Kontakty, just to convince their users that for pro-war narratives. But basically, at this moment, I think. Answering your question, I don't see any idea out of my head that how to distinguish the importance of this network in terms of size versus the importance in terms of social demographics. My intuition is rather is that it's not. It's something about the size, but also something about Kremlin's realization that it's simply, with all these technical capabilities, etc., it's simply hard to convince the oppositionally minded anti-war Russians, and they have to keep their loyal constituencies loyal, because also the partial mobilization requires this effort. So. These are entangled issues. These are entangled features of these networks. I think, we have to think harder how to maybe distinguish these effects.
I'm also going to abuse the chair's power again and ask Kristina. So you make a very persuasive case. Can I ask you to play the other side? And say, if Kremlin hired you and said, you need to defend us against these, charges by, Western organizations that are trying to bring. Are there counter arguments, or what are the kinds of counter arguments that you would expect would be made in this setting? Maybe that's a puts you in a less morally odious position, and perhaps is maybe a little bit more enlightening.
The Kremlin sanctioned me instead of hiring me. So So, I think that we're in a case where, as I said, there's generally 3 types of atrocity crimes that you're looking for. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So the case against war crimes, I think most people know that that's pretty well established. The case against crime against humanity is now being expressed even by maybe the more sort of hesitant lawyers who are thinking not just about always exactly what the truth is, but what will also stand up in court with an evidentiary process. And now we have the lawyers weighing in. And so I think that really there's also a very strong case for genocide as well. So in terms of thinking what they might push back against, I'm not sure what they'll come up with. It's always the hardest thing when people say, explain what perpetrator logic is. You've seen both the dehumanizing language, and so you'd have to explain that away in some way. You've got dehumanizing language going back long before 2022, before genocide. You're looking for the overlap of motive, which is expressed in language, and genocidal actions. So they would have to both explain away both the rhetoric and then as well as the actions. So I won't comment further because I'm not going to make a counter legal case for anyone listening in, but they have some very serious explaining to do. I'm not sure how they do it.
Let's go.
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. Try to be very quick. On public opinion, support of the war, there's a lot of contradictory data out there. Depends who you ask and what you ask. I guess the folks at Princeton are finding that support may be under 50%. Prague did a Russian field report that said that 10% of Russians said they would go and fight in Ukraine. 20% said they'd go and fight for money. 40% said they wouldn't go to fight under any circumstances. So it really is confusing data. But my real question for both Marat and Jean-François is whether there has been any horizontal communication among the non-Russian republics. I mean, those of us who lived through the fall of the Soviet Union remember how strong that was and how much it upset people in Moscow. I mean, my favorite was when the Uzbeks finally got around to coming up with their sort of statement of national independence, they simply copied the Estonian one, word for word, which is a hard translation project. But we're seeing now among the non-Russians, especially in the Far East, a lot of talk, resentment over the number of people being drafted. And I'm wondering if you've seen any of that.
Sure. I thought we'd taking a couple more. We are seeing a couple of informal movements linking up their grievances with decolonization. Now at the Republican level, I don't see it as much. I would not, it's not a trend, but certainly.
Republic?
Sorry?
No North Caucasus Republic?
Not really, no.
Actually, if I can, if I can ask you just a 2-point on that. You're doing this research. How are you seeing who's arriving where from Syria? There was that in the discourses about anti-colonial discourses. Like, where are you seeing this stuff?
Oh, you see it in the community, you see it on social media a lot. You can track fighters pretty easily these days. We're not at a Syria moment where they were killed during the intervention. So they are very proud to talk where they are, who's they're fighting, what they think. It's an open buffet of social media if you want to study insurgent movement that are planning to go in Russia in the coming years. They're all over Ukraine. It's really, if you have enough time to spend on clicking on Twitter and Telegram, I think I would think, yeah, it's all good days of the pre-Islamic State in 2012, 2013, where all your methodology can be on social media. I think better enjoy it now until they change their pattern. But back in the days, you could follow your cooking classes with the Islamic State. Now it's pretty much the battlefield and the front on a daily basis of fighter and their opinion.
even if you don't have time on Twitter to be clicking on them, you'll still find the time.
Yeah.
I wanted to weigh in on Harley's original point on public opinion and support for the war. And I mean, the data that you point to, those are very different things. Like you could say, I support the war, but I'm not going to fight. Someone else can fight it. So I don't think that's necessarily an indictment of survey companies or Russians' willingness to respond. And I think, we need to recognize that for all kinds of surveys, differences in question wording are going to make a big difference. Also, it might be the case that opinions are changing over time as new information is revealed. So one of the things that's interesting from the Princeton group is just how stable a lot of the responses are. And we did with Kyle Marquardt, John Reuter, and Scott Gelbach, we did an update to our Is Putin Popular research that we did in 2015, 2016, and we updated it in a PONARS memo that if people are interested in, they can take a look at that. And it does include one survey that was done in June of 2022, when we didn't find huge differences between the pre-war and the post-war samples in their willingness to respond openly. But we did find that from our 2015, 2016 research to our 2021, 2022 research, a lot more uncertainty. And then our ability to say that Russians were honestly answering the question is much higher now than it was before. So there's lots of caveats. Read the memo, and if you have any questions, get in touch with us. Yeah, please.
Answering your question, I don't know if you have seen this event that I have mentioned at the beginning of my presentation of Jamestown and Hudson Institute. Yeah, so the idea that was presented there by the foreign minister of Chechnya was about this North Caucasian state, like common state that has its roots in just post Bolshevik coup in Russian Empire, and this republic was kind of non-existent, only on paper. It was the idea of several intellectuals and Russian imperial military officers, and the Chechen government in exile is trying to revive it now, claiming that there is a background for it, and there are some movements in other North Caucasian republics. So there would be unity, and there would be a bigger state. There would be a better claim for independence and all that. And in this, I support Jeff's idea that actually it's only on paper.
Oh, can you just say who you are and your affiliation?
Oh, I'm nobody.
Oh, we're all somebody.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm with Freedom House. So I actually want to respond to what I guess, sir, your question about the survey results. And I'm struck by Kristina, your presentation. I wonder if we are not seeing the forest for the trees. Is there actually ambiguity in these survey results, or is this just a demonstration of what you were talking about with the moral reconfiguration?
So I've wondered that too. I was taking some notes and wondering that myself. So it's a great question that's also on my mind. You know, I was asked, and it's a roundabout way to address your question, but I was asked last March if there might be more mothers' protests in Russia when more bodies started coming home. And I said, I really hope so. I was really hoping that there would be protests in Russia. But I said that there's another possibility, and that is the more bodies come home, the more challenging it will be for large groups of mothers to realize that their sons died as war criminals in a pointless war for no reason, with a country that was not attacking them or threatening Russia's security. It's a tough psychological pill, right? And so then you're almost kind of like psychologically incentivized to believe that there must be some reason for this war. Ukraine must have been some threat, or NATO must have been some threat. And so when I look at that, or when I look at the small activities, right, it's the small stuff like the dressing up children, like in these war costumes, or when I look at getting people to participate with packing care packages for Russian soldiers and Russian society, it's involving like your mind and your hands in this activity. It's actually quite smart on the government's part because it's involving average citizens. And then it's harder for them to accept that this is a pointless, illegal, immoral war. They've participated in it in a small way, or they have friends who did. So that's where those are the things that I'm concerned about, if that's a roundabout way to.
And one point on casualties and public opinion. The one country where this has been studied a lot is the US case. And the findings are, somewhat diverse, but one finding that I think people generally accept is that Americans were willing to accept war casualties as long as we were winning, as long as the US was winning. When things were going well, and they would say, oh, maybe the game is worth the candle. But for example, after the Tet Offensive and the Vietnam War, people became much more sensitive to casualties. So in that way, how the war is perceived in Russia as going well or going badly might have a big impact on how people respond to increasing casualties. That would be one. So we have a bunch of questions here. We'll start in the front and then go in the back. We've also have some online, and I should say also that we have a hard stop at 3 o'clock because I have to catch a train. So that's
I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I wouldn't write off wives and mothers really at all. And I think the prime example is probably Argentina, where the wives and mothers essentially overthrew the government in response to the pointless attack on the Malvinas Falkland Islands. Why is that important here? Because Russian demographics have been flat since like 1990, which means when you lose your kid, that's probably your only kid. Whereas the Muslim population has been growing a little more. By perhaps the end of the century, we'll see Russia that is predominantly Muslim. And that's got to affect what's going on right now when you're disproportionately going east of the Ural Mountains and recruiting people for this pointless war.
Comment?
I can do it in a sentence. So I would never discount the important role that women play, including wives and mothers. However, my question has always been, when the bodies come home, when they lose their only son, the demographics, I absolutely agree. But will the mothers therefore then oppose the war, or will they just hate Ukraine and the West more? Who will they blame? And that's where I'm trying to figure that out.
In the back, and then we'll go.
Alexandra Koy, UK School of Economics, and also Petra, a Ukrainian Studies Fellow here. So I have a question to Kristina Hook. On one of the slides, you mentioned actors on the genocide. They were bystanders on the last line. There was recently the Sustainable Peace Manifesto of the Ukrainian civil society, where they also refer to, they call it collective guilt, some other call it collective responsibility. So, and they urge for reparations to be perceived not as a punishment for the Russian society, but as a kind of easier way to make it right to Ukrainian society. From your studies on genocide, is this a way or one of the ways to sort of include the bystanders and other instruments that the policymakers should think about in this regard?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's such a great question. So I can tell you a few things that I'm paying attention to. So first of all, I think that language of guilt and responsibility goes back to Hannah Arendt. And so guilt is the people who will be found guilty in a court of law. Responsibility is something deeper. So society, bystanders. I do think that it will be, I think the best thing that could happen for Russian society is to decisively lose this war and have that process. That's what we saw in Germany, allow Germany to become like a responsible and thriving member of the modern world. My concern and what I'm looking for is a very different set of circumstances in Germany, very briefly, but there were specific things that I did not know about until I looked into it this year that occupying Allied forces did to help German society accept what had happened, showing courtroom footage of and that will not be the situation in Russia. And so what I would say to Russians is that it is really on you, like you will not have like a sort of occupational authorities inviting your society to consider these things that can begin your transformation back. It's really on the Russian society to make that choice of acknowledging collective responsibility. I think viewing reparations in that way could be a socially helpful thing.
But when we take both questions, then we'll.
Hello, Taylor from the Department of State. I'm curious as to what appropriate actions should be taken to combat Russian misinformation about Ukrainian Nazification, especially in countries that are susceptible to that propaganda once Ukrainians relocate to those countries.
Hi, my name is Milana. I'm a Chechen journalist. I just have a couple of comments, a question. First of all, thank you for this very interesting panel. And I just want to say about the, thank you, Jean-François, for this, very interesting topic and being so involved in this. So about the idea that Chechen independency can be like, be led by Ramzan Kadyrov, I really doubt that can happen because of there's too much blood between regular Chechens and Mr. Kadyrov. And second of all, I don't think that the idea of Ichkeria was like mentioned the first time and suddenly, because in Chechen language, maybe Marat knows about that. In Chechen language, he always played with this Ichkerian people. He had this message that I'm like was a strong supporter of the idea of independence of Ichkeria, and that's why he has so many people of Ichkeria surrounding him, the high rank people. And I think he is trying to he did this thing now in the Russian language, and that's the really new thing. But before that, for Chechens, he did use this the message. And again, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel want to respond?
I can try answering to you, Miss Ukraine. One thing about it, I don't believe that Kadyrov will ride the idea of independence, but I think he might try to find a way to mix and match in a way self-determination within a framework of Russian patriotism as they have been trying to do, but in a decolonization discourse. So Ichkeria is part of the Russian Federation, a decentralized Russian Federation. So adapting this discourse to the time in a way. I'm not sure it will be successful. It is a difficult speech act to do compared to other things, but it's certainly, as you mentioned, the fact that it is made in Russian, addressed to a Russian audience is something interesting and underlining a potential change in his internal strategy.
Yeah, I think it's quite a different idea that Kadyrov wanted to say with this position himself as a kind of supporter of Ichkeria. It's not that he's supporter, he's trying to self-legitimize himself, being nationalistic, performing as nationalist. As for this message, he was criticizing the West. It was not support to Ichkeria.
I want to thank Kristina, Marat, Jean-François, Andrei, Miriam, was a really terrific panel. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So please join me in giving them a big round of applause.